All right, hello everybody. Thank you so much for attending my talk. My name is Jason. I'm a senior consultant, mostly within the government and public sector, specializing in cybersecurity assurance, advisory, and risk management. What that sort of means to say is I figured out that I can tinker and tailor, deal with cybersecurity controls, know what they are, know what they should be, but realized I'm probably not naughty enough to try breaking them in a pen test. Now, I'm going to start with a bit of a cautionary tale, right? There was an organization, for obvious reasons I won't name them, who decided, okay, I want to use a software as a service platform, a SaaS platform, right? Because it's cheaper, it gets the job done, it's really easy to use, right? They have decided to use that for practically everything in the business, particularly its most critical business process. It's pretty much the lifeblood of the organization. If that SaaS platform were to fall over, it's curtains. The company wouldn't be able to operate. Everything goes back to paper. It would have been a mess. Yeah? This particular organization relies heavily on very sensitive information, things that really need to be kept more than just under lock and key, perhaps blood covenant or contract, NDA, and what have you, right? Things that need to be really protected. Through happenstance, an ad hoc independent review actually decided to audit said SaaS provider, and then they realized there are some gaps, like no security event monitoring. That means the hacker could have just walked right in, took whatever it wanted, went away, and the SaaS provider just goes, nothing to see here, everything's all good. And in effect, they have essentially transformed SaaS, software as a service, to SaaS, selling assets and their soul. Look, we're not Johann Goethe, I'm not Johann Goethe, none of you are Faust, and that SaaS provider is not Mephisto. Certainly no contract was signed to actually sell their soul. Bit of a dramatic thing, but at the same time, those consequences were pretty severe. Thankfully, in this case, they managed to talk it out, they managed to negotiate and actually start applying some of the critical controls that were missed. But at the same time, I think one can really agree that was a little bit unnecessary now, wasn't it? So, this presentation will cover how you can prevent that from happening. We'll talk a little bit about cloud computing and what that means for managing your cybersecurity risks and protecting your information assets, and how to apply third-party risk management to mitigate those risks. So back again to a little bit of background, and I realize I'm probably 5 to 10 years late because now everybody's on Gen AI, but organizations have really moved on to the cloud, right? Because it turns the capital expense of actually buying all your servers and setting all this stuff up to an operational expense. It's the vendor's problem, right? They can set it all up, and I just have to use it. I just open up my web browser, all good, no problems, right? So that sort of looks at, IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, so infrastructure. You just get a CPU, get some storage, spin it up, do your own thing. Platform as a service, you get an operating system, you get some libraries, you can just develop the code, off it goes. SaaS is probably the most ubiquitous, most common, because all you got to do is just get a computer, get a web browser, off you go. You're done, right? That's why it's become really popular. Unfortunately for us, though, that little shared responsibility matrix, hopefully that's not going to work. That shared responsibility matrix on the left-hand side tells you what your vendor does, what you do. The business side is probably going to think, oh, great, all that light blue stuff is not my problem anymore. I don't have to worry about it. If you're in the technical side, you're shaking and you're screaming and you're scared because that's no longer your problem. You have no control over what your vendor does for that. You are entirely entrusting your organization's data to that vendor and what they decide to do and what controls they decide to put in. You need to trust that your vendor can keep your data safe. Of course, on the business end of it, obviously you remember there's a bit of dark blue. It also means that the cloud isn't just a free pass to say, oh, they've got it all covered. Everything is going to be secure. I don't have to worry about it. There are certain things that remain your responsibility, even in the cloud. To name a few, identity and access management. Sure, you might not have to spin up your own Active Directory instance, but you still need to figure out who your users are, what their identities are, email, password, blah, 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 and what sort of access they're allowed to have. You can implement this by just doing it in the SaaS platform. Hopefully they've implemented that. You might want to connect it to your own AD or identity access management platform and so on and so forth. You might even try to use a cloud access security broker, a CASB, to sort of monitor, keep tabs on who's accessing what and whether or not they're allowed to do that. Because the vendor is not going to be responsible for if somebody gets a bit of stolen creds, logs in, uses it, and realizes, everybody's admin. I can do whatever I want. That's not their problem. That's not their responsibility. Endpoint security as well. If I've got a laptop here, I use it to access a SaaS platform. I need to make sure that it's secure. I need to make sure that nobody can just pick it up, log in, and just fire away. You make sure it's not stolen as well. And so that might just be mobile device management and whatnot. That's still not the vendor's responsibility. If somebody puts in a bit of malware, maybe a remote access Trojan, and then just starts rattling away at a SaaS platform. And of course, privacy and data management. You're responsible for what you decide to put into a cloud platform at all, right? If you sort of go and say, look, I've got this very sensitive information, I'm happy to put that in the cloud. You need to have done your risk assessments, you need to have understood what that means for your organization. So, coming back to that whole point about the vendor is now responsible for a lot of the controls that you used to be, how do I trust them? How do I figure out that they're trustworthy, they do the things that I would do to keep my data safe if I had control over it? Enter third-party risk management. Quite common in procurement and finance circles. They do this a fair bit with their contracts, suppliers, and vendors and whatnot. But increasingly becoming very, very well known within industry standards for cybersecurity. ISO 27001 has a whole set, well, Annex A, to be precise, has a whole set of controls around third-party risk management, and particularly one for the cloud. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework has that too. You go to the Prudential Regulation Authority for Banks and Financial Services in Australia. CPS 234 talks about that, and many, many more that I can talk about, right? Regulators are also looking at it. It starts with a risk assessment, understanding, what's the data I've got and what sort of risk does that pose if that were to be leaked or whatever. Procurement and due diligence, so figuring out your vendor, figuring out if they have the right controls. Onboarding and contracts, actually signing the contract and saying, hey, this is what you agreed to do for us. These are the controls you said you would have. Monitoring to make sure that's actually still in place. And if you decide to leave, offboarding, figuring out what happens to your data after that. So, first of all, to start assessing a SaaS vendor, you need to figure out why you're using it in the first place and what sort of data you're putting up there. Figure out the software's purpose. What are you using it for? Is it a critical business process? Is it maybe just a marketing tool or a design tool that doesn't really have that much sensitive data? Because then that goes to, that determines the data that gets processed at all. And as well, there's a bit of a bonus here. What's the tone from the top? What is your organization saying? Is there a policy or a strategy that says, hey, we really need to do something about this. We need to install a new piece of software to make this faster, make this easier, right? If that doesn't really exist, you might want to question why you have the software in the first place. I'm going to allude to this a little bit later, but you don't really have to mitigate a risk you don't take, right? And then, of course, based on the data that you're processing, you can break it down into CIA. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I'm not talking about the intelligence agency in the US. Confidentiality risk, of course, is what's going to happen if somebody gets access to that data when they really shouldn't have, right? Integrity, what happens if somebody changes it and I didn't know about it? Availability, what happens if I want to access it and it's gone? That really depends on the data that's being processed. I might not necessarily care if public marketing material was leaked. I probably don't want it to not be available when it needs to be. I may not necessarily care about, let's say there's a certification register saying who has what certification. I might not necessarily care that it's leaked, it's already public, but I probably wouldn't want to have, say, I earned said certification, somebody crossed off my name, or somebody added their own name. Probably not a good idea, right? And then compliance requirements. You've got certain data, and sometimes it's so sensitive that the law has decided, listen up, you need to do these things. Personal information, you've got the Privacy Act. Health information, sort of a bit of a subset in that, so on and so forth. All of that will determine your control requirements. What sort of stuff that you need your vendor to do for you. Sometimes it's going to be similar to the stuff that you do normally, sometimes it's stricter. So if you've already figured out those controls, good. You can then figure out what you need to ask your vendor, what to expect of them. This is really important because of something in risk management called the risk appetite. Everybody's got one. In real life, it's the difference between whether you would rather spend your holiday going skydiving or just chilling out at the beach, right? What sort of risks you're willing to take. It's important to understand that because you don't want to overcook your controls. You don't want to look for a vendor that has pretty much everything and is as safe as Fort Knox, right? You might not find a vendor at all. You also don't want to undercook it and look for somebody just, whoever can do the job, and then realize they don't have any controls. This process might also lead you to think about this. You don't have to mitigate a risk you don't take. Can't mitigate a risk that doesn't exist, right? You might decide the risk is too great, and you decide, hey, okay, I am just going to install software that sits on premises. Just do that. You don't have to worry about a cloud vendor anymore. That data's not going to reach them at all. You might want to use another type of cloud service. You might just develop your own code, push it to a platform as a service or infrastructure as a service. Sure, it's in the cloud, but you have a little bit more control over what controls you can put in place. Now, you've probably figured out all the controls and all of that stuff. How do you figure out if a vendor is secure? I'll put a bit of an example. If you're trying to find a bit of software, you're probably first thinking, what are the functional requirements? What are the things I needed to do, right? If I'm looking for an HR platform, I want it to be able to help me recruit for people, I want it to help me manage them, and I want it to also help me manage when they leave, for example. You might then go and look for vendors, read their website, look at their glossy marketing material, or even phone a friend. They've used the platform before, they can tell you if it's good or not. The same principles apply when figuring out whether a vendor has cybersecurity controls. The highest level of assurance, or essentially how much you can trust them, is an independent audit. It's the same idea as a customer review. If somebody else has given you their thoughts about whether or not a vendor is actually secure or not, you're more likely to trust them than what the vendor has to say about themselves. However, of course, some vendors are not going to share that with you, or they might not even have it. So the next best thing is obviously a vendor security white paper. So that glossy marketing material that they put up and say, hey, we are really secure. Look at all this cool stuff we've got. Right? That's pretty good. It's still from them, but at least it's in writing. The last one, which is a bit unfortunate, because honestly it takes more effort, but is not nearly as good, is to ring them up yourself and say, hey, we've got some questions. Can you answer them for us about your security? It already takes enough effort as it is to talk to them. It's even worse when you realize that they can just ad-lib it and say whatever they want on the fly. What level of assurance you need is going to depend on the risk that your data has. If you're just dealing with very non-sensitive information, you might be okay with them not having an independent audit report. If they don't have ISO 27001 certification or a SOC 2, not a massive issue. Sometimes you need that. Now, raise your hand if you've decided to try a bit of software, they give you an end-user license agreement, and you just go, I'm just going to skip it. I know I have. Okay, good. Thankfully, I didn't see too many hands raised up for those of you looking online. I do hope you don't do this when you're actually selecting a cloud security provider for your organization. You definitely don't want to TLDR those types of agreements. They're still legal documents, so if you sign that and you don't know what's in it, you've signed away information assets. You don't know what they are going to commit to. You don't know what sort of information security controls you're going to hold them accountable for. Work with your legal team if you're sort of in any doubt as to how to properly read and interpret those documents. Particularly when your data is very sensitive, you probably don't want to take that risk. What are the things that you should be looking for, though, in that contract? Say if you wanted to do that yourself, what would you look for? If I had to do that, I'd look at data management and sovereignty and ownership. If I give this vendor my data, legally, who owns it? Hopefully it says I still own that. Otherwise, you're going to end up in a bit of a legal stoush about them going, oh, this is my data, now I can do whatever I want with it, right? And this bit certain vendors in the butt at some point when they had essentially said, oh, now all your data is going to be sent to generative AI, and you have to opt out of it. That caused a bit of a furor back then, didn't it? Data sovereignty is another one as well. Some data is so sensitive that you can't let it leave Australia. So you need to make sure that your contract says it won't. Standards, industry standards like ISO 27001, are you going to hold your vendor to account for that? Making sure that they maintain that certification. Bonus point, Sometimes your data is sensitive or related to critical infrastructure, and then you need to start thinking about FOCI, foreign ownership, control, influence, right? Is this vendor Australian? Will they always be Australian? Will they not be influenced by any other foreign adversary? Sometimes you might also have to look at the SOCI Act, right? Security of critical infrastructure. Are there any requirements there that need to be in your contract? Specific controls, sometimes. Sometimes you might also need to ensure that your contractor said, oh, we have an incident response plan. We know what to do when that happens. We will fail over and recover your system if it ever goes down, and we'll guarantee that it's always up 99.9% of the time. I'm sure all of you have probably heard of those sorts of service level agreements before. Assurance as well. How do I hold them to account? Right? They've said all these wonderful things about how they'll keep everything secure. But can we go back next year and make sure that that's still the case? Remedies. What if we find out that they didn't do as they promised? What do we get then? Some of you have messed with the cloud, may have already heard of service credits, and that's probably something I'd be looking for as well. If the server or the system goes down for longer than expected, do I get a discount? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. And support. Who do I go to if something's broken, right? And to what degree? 24/7, business hours, all that stuff. Maybe you've gone and done that entire review and you're going, nah, not so sure about this anymore. They've certainly not written things that I would have expected them to have. For some SaaS providers, some vendors, you might be able to actually go and talk to them and say, hey, I'm really interested in your software, but there's some certain things that I want to clarify and put on paper. You might be able to negotiate, and in this case, if you can work with your legal team and write up a standard clause bank to say, if I need them to be held to a certain standard, this is what I need to put in my contract. If you have something like that, that could be helpful. Otherwise, you can assess the risk of your departures and go, okay, these are things that are wrong. Can I live with that, right? So what if it doesn't meet ISO 27001 to the nth degree to this certain clause? Is that a problem for me? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Raise your hand if you've ever had to deal with a security audit and you're going, oh God, I have to fix all of this. And I go and fix it. Good, good. I saw one hand. All right. Well, I really, really hope that you wouldn't accept that for your vendor, right? You probably don't want your vendor going, all the security is just like this. An auditor comes in, everything gets fixed, and then afterwards they go, forget all of this, I'm done. This is too much effort for me, right? You make sure that your vendor doesn't do this by keeping tabs on them, by implementing regular monitoring. You probably might want to do this once or twice a year. That changes again depending on the data that you've held. Sometimes you might want to do it when something's changed. If your data suddenly become more valuable, or if there's a new piece of regulation and legislation that says, you need to protect your data like this now, you might want to do a bit of checking. A little bit like how you would assess them at the start, you have different levels of how you can assess them going forward as well in monitoring. The highest effort, but also the highest assurance, is commissioning an audit. You can either go to them yourself and go and say, hey, I'm going to audit your security controls. Show us what you got. Or commission somebody else to go and do that for you, right? It's probably the highest effort, and some vendors actually don't quite like you messing around with their stuff. So the next best thing is to review independent assurance documentation. Sometimes, if they've already done an audit, like ISO 27001, SOC 2, and the like, they're probably going to have to do it again in a year or two's time. If you review that documentation, you can figure out what's changed and if that's a problem for you. The lowest assurance is attestation. Just ask them, hey, has anything changed? What about these controls? Do you still have them? Because obviously, naturally, a vendor who wants to keep a client happy is just going to absolutely say, yes, we have everything you've asked for. But then you can't really hold them to it now, can you? Because they can just say whatever they want. If you open the door with some pizza and everything's on fire like that, your systems are busted, I can't log in, I can't do anything, this is what you need to do. Or, to start with, what you should have done. make sure that your vendor has those incident response and disaster recovery processes in place, right? That's a key control that they need to have. They need to know how to identify an incident that's happened, be able to tell you that it's happened, and actually take steps to respond to it, and also recover as well. If, for example, that incident has resulted in systems going down, you make sure that they have committed that they're going to do something about it. Maybe spin up a new instance, do it somewhere else. Maybe if it's not in Sydney, do it in Melbourne this time, and just keep the system going. Your own IRDR plans, and this is sort of a question I sometimes get, oh, everything's in the cloud. I can't do anything about that. What do I do then? Right? At the very least, your plan itself is contact the vendor, here's their contact details, here's who I need to talk to, and what am I going to do in the interim? Right? Maybe I have to use a paper-based process. The reason why that's important is because with SaaS, you can't really do anything. Right? All that software is in the vendor's hands. All the servers are in their hands. It's probably not practical for you to then just go find another vendor, turn it on, use it for the time being until your current SaaS vendor goes back online. Probably not the most practical. All right. If you've gone and done all of your monitoring, you've read your contracts, you've read the new independent assurance documentation, and you realize something's wrong, something's changed, and I don't know what to do about it, you go through the same sort of risk assessment. You sort of try to understand, okay, this new independent assurance report has said that their identity and access management has changed. They do maybe less of a regular review, or they found certain issues, like people getting granted admin access across the entire company. Think about what that means for your data, if that's going to be a problem, right? If admin access is granted en masse, does that mean everybody has access to my data? Is that a problem? Probably would be. And in that case, you can just start amicably, right? Do it in a friendly way. Just discuss with your vendor and say, hey, we read this, we're a little bit concerned. What can we do about it? What sort of controls can we put in place to prevent that, right? Otherwise, you can start reading a contract and actually going, you did promise me you'd give me a discount if something happened. Please do. Or you can apply your own compensating controls. In particular, because with SaaS, the only thing you've got control over is your own data, you can probably just tokenize, mask, or hash it. If you can't trust your vendor with your data, just give them a fake, give them a dummy, and you figure out what that data actually means when you receive it again. Otherwise, if none of that works, prepare to leave. And if you're prepared to leave, make sure they do that. Make sure they do what's on the left-hand side and shred and destroy everything. Sometimes you might not need to go that far. Sometimes you are okay with them just desensitizing, anonymizing the data. It's probably okay. But try to make sure that your contract already says what it is that they have committed to you, they'll do when you leave. There's nothing worse than leaving a vendor and then realizing, oh, they've got all this data and they've now fed it into an advertising machine or something like that. Of course, as well, if you're trying to leave your vendor, try to get an export of the data you gave them so that you can very easily migrate to the next platform. In summary, and for those of you watching at home, if you just need a 2-minute summary, this is as good as it's going to get. The cloud is just somebody else's computer. I'm sure we've heard of that before. What that means is that a lot of the things that you normally have control over are no longer in your control. And so you need to take these steps to actually understand what your vendor has committed to doing on your behalf. Your data determines the controls that you need. If you're using a system to handle less sensitive data, that's a good thing. That means you might not have to hold them to a lot of controls, but if it's really sensitive, you need to think about those controls, or better yet, just go and say, I'm not doing it at all. I would rather not use the SaaS platform. It's too risky. Don't sign away your assets. Read your contract and make sure that it actually has everything you know that it needs for protection. Risk management is not ever a once-off. You can go through this entire process and actually assess the vendor when you're just about to sign them on. But at the same time, you also need to make sure that you're monitoring them as well, because things change. Things change in a year, 3 years, 5 years, right? I mean, I think if we think about it, last month or probably 3 weeks ago, we probably thought Cyclone Alfred was going to hit us X date. Next day, never showed up, right? And then we waited the next day and the next day and the next day. That's the whole thing. You have to always keep tabs. Things change. You need to know what to do when things go pear-shaped. When things go a little bit wrong, maybe a system incident has happened, or you've decided that certain controls aren't there anymore, you need to know what to do. You need to risk assess what you found and take action. And then, of course, ensure that your vendor isn't holding on to any of your data. Make sure that they've committed that they're getting rid of it, or at the very least, just get rid of the names, right? I wouldn't want a vendor to hold on to my data and it still says Jason Rumengan. I would probably rather they just change my name to John Doe, right? Now, you've probably heard all this and gone, okay, what next? If you haven't done this already, document the processes that have been discussed. It's probably good for it all to be in somebody's head for now, but if you were to be sick or you were to leave or something like that, that process is good as gone. Documenting it makes sure that other people can follow along. And also, chances are you're probably not going to do it yourself. If you're in a cyber team, you're probably not the one responsible for buying software. Probably that's somebody else in your business deciding, I need to design something. I'm going to go find a SaaS platform that helps me do that, right? So in that case, you might want to talk to your procurement team or your finance team or pretty much anybody else in your business to say, hey, I know you want to use certain software because it's going to make your life easier, but here's the things you need to do so you don't give me a headache when that data gets breached. When you go through a process like this, it's always a good idea as well to record the stuff you found. If you found that there are certain data that you've put into the cloud, the risks that are associated with it, like, if this were to get breached, then my company is going to go up on the news and people will not stop talking about us in a bad way. Right? And also the vendors that you've decided to send that data to. Make a record of that so you know to come back in a year or two to say, has anything changed from any of this? Do I need to go back to my vendor and ask them for a new report? What do I have to do? Right? And then, of course, there's not much of a point in writing a process that nobody knows about. So train your team. Have a conversation and extend the olive branch and say, hey, I know that we're asking you to take care and actually think about information security, but if you ever get lost, feel free to contact us. There's nothing worse than being on the receiving end of, all this stuff. You need to do all this stuff to even start using a piece of software. It's even better if you can go ahead and tell them, we're here to help. If you're not sure, just contact us. Better for you to contact us and we'll work through it together than you getting it wrong and then all of our data suddenly in the cloud and then into the dark web. Right? And a bit of a bonus here, if you've listened to the presentation and gone, I didn't really think of that, I would probably make it an action to look at all your SaaS vendors and actually think, are any of these particularly suspicious and need a bit more review and attention? That's probably what I'd be doing. So hopefully that was a little bit helpful to sort of figure out what you can do when something needs to go into the cloud because you want to use a SaaS provider. I am more than happy for you to reach out if you have any questions, but that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. All right. That's that.
I think the third last slide that Jason had with his sort of summary that he did for 2 minutes, a lot of hot tips on that slide. I know a bunch of people, I could see people nodding in the audience. Yeah, it might be about Gen AI, but this is what everyone's actually dealing with in the real world most of the time. So thanks, Jason. Thank you very much on behalf of CrikeyCon. We will be back shortly in a couple of minutes with our next speaker. Please thank Jason again.